My husband hid his mistress for 10 years. She wrote, "Your husband and I have 2 children. He chose me." I silently made one phone call. When he came home, Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Claire Whitmore, and for 10 years I believed I had the life most women only dream about. We lived in a craftsman house on Maplewood Drive in Portland, Oregon, the kind of house with a wide front porch, hanging ferns, and a kitchen that always smelled like coffee. Daniel and I had met in our late 20s at a mutual friend's dinner party. He was an architect, tall and measured in everything he did, the kind of man who remembered your coffee order and held doors open without making a performance of it. We married after 2 years of dating. I taught high school English. We had a golden retriever named Scout, a vegetable garden that only half worked, and Sunday mornings that belonged entirely to us. We didn't have children, not by tragedy, but by choice. We'd talked about it, circled it, and quietly agreed that our life felt complete as it was. I never second-guessed that. I never second-guessed much about us at all. That was my first mistake. The signs, when I look back now, were never invisible. They were just dressed in ordinary clothes, and I kept mistaking them for normal wear and tear. It started small. Daniel had always been a private person. That was part of what drew me to him, that contained self-sufficient quality. So when he began leaving the room to take calls, I didn't immediately attach meaning to it. Architects get calls at odd hours. Projects run over. Clients panic. I told myself these things, and I believed them, the way you believe something because the alternative requires a kind of courage you're not ready for yet. Then came the travel. Daniel's firm had a regional office in Seattle, about 3 hours north of us. He'd always made the occasional trip, but somewhere around year 7 of our marriage, the trips multiplied. Once a month became twice. Twice became every other week. He always had explanations. A major mixed-use development, a historic renovation that was running behind schedule, a client who insisted on in-person meetings. The explanations were never implausible. That was the thing about Daniel. He was never sloppy. He was precise in all things, including his lies. I noticed he'd changed his phone passcode. I noticed it the way you notice a piece of furniture has been moved. Not immediately, but in that moment when you reach for something and your hand finds empty air. I asked him about it once, casually, the way you ask about something you're already afraid to know the answer to. He said his IT department had sent a company-wide security update. He showed me an email to prove it. I nodded and let it go. Why did I let it go? Because I loved him. Because 10 years is a long time and I had built my entire adult life inside that time. Because some part of me understood that once you pull a thread, the whole thing can unravel, and I wasn't ready to live in the unraveling. But the body knows things, the mind refuses. I started sleeping badly. I'd wake at 2 or 3 in the morning and lie in the dark listening to Daniel breathe, and I'd feel something cold and shapeless sitting on my chest. Not jealousy exactly, something older than that, something closer to grief. I tried talking to him, not about my suspicions, I couldn't name them clearly enough for that, but about us, about distance, about the feeling I had, vague but persistent, that we were becoming strangers who shared a mortgage and a dog. He listened. He was always good at listening. He said he'd been under pressure. He said he was sorry. He held me that night, and I almost convinced myself I had imagined everything. Almost. It was a Tuesday evening in March when everything changed. Daniel was in Seattle, again, and I was grading papers at the kitchen table, Scout asleep at my feet, rain hitting the windows in that particular Pacific Northwest way that usually comforts me. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I assumed it was a spam message or a misdial. I almost set it back down without reading it. I didn't. Hello, Claire. My name is Melissa Hart. I think it's time you knew the truth about your husband. Daniel and I have been together for 10 years. We have 2 children, a boy, 7, and a girl, 4. He has been living a double life. He chose me. I thought you deserved to know. I read it 3 times. Then I set the phone face down on the table very carefully, the way you set down something fragile, and I sat completely still while Scout shifted in his sleep and the rain kept coming. 10 years, 2 children. He chose me. The words didn't hit me like a blow. They hit me like a diagnosis, the kind a doctor delivers quietly, the kind you already knew was coming before you even sat down in the office. I didn't cry. I didn't call Daniel. I didn't call anyone. I picked up the phone again, and I made one call, not to my husband, not to a friend, to my attorney. The attorney I called was a woman named Patricia Okafor. I'd met her 3 years earlier at a fundraiser for the school district. She was on the board. I was representing the teachers' union. We'd stayed loosely in touch, the way professional women do, trading occasional emails, liking each other's posts. I'd never imagined calling her for this. She answered on the 3rd ring despite the late hour. I told her what had happened in a voice so flat and steady it frightened me. She didn't express shock or sympathy immediately. She asked 3 questions. Was I safe? Was Daniel home? Did we have any jointly held financial accounts? Safe. No. Yes. Several. Don't move any money, she said. Don't confront him. Don't delete that message. Screenshot it, back it up, and email it to yourself from a private account he doesn't have access to. Can you do that tonight? I said yes. I'll clear time tomorrow afternoon. Come to my office at 2. After I hung up, I sat in that kitchen for a long time. The rain had eased. Scout had woken and put his head in my lap, and I let my hand rest on his skull the way I always did, feeling his warmth, his steadiness. Dogs know when something is wrong. He didn't move for an hour. I tried to do the math of it. 10 years, which meant the affair had begun almost at the start of our marriage, or perhaps even before. The boy was 7. That meant Melissa had gotten pregnant in year 3 of our marriage, possibly year 2. I thought about that. I thought about what year 3 had looked like for us. We'd taken a trip to Italy that summer. I still had the photos on my laptop, Daniel with his arm around me outside the Pantheon, both of us squinting into the light. Had she already been pregnant then? Had he already known? The arithmetic was brutal. 2 children meant 2 pregnancies, 2 births, 7 years of raising a family in parallel to ours. This wasn't an affair. This was a second life. Carefully constructed, consistently maintained, deliberate in every detail. The precision of it, Daniel's precision, which I had once admired, now felt like a kind of violence. I didn't cry that night. I'm not sure why. Maybe because crying required feeling, and feeling required accepting what was true, and some survival mechanism in me was keeping that door shut until I'd done what needed to be done. I've always been that way. My mother used to say I was made of good Appalachian stock. You grieve later, after the work is finished. I made myself eat something. Toast. I brushed my teeth. I went through the motions of a normal night while something fundamental was dismantling itself inside me, quietly, like a building coming down floor by floor. In bed, I stared at the ceiling and I made a list, not on paper, in my head, the way I'd always organize things. What did I actually know? What did I need to find out? What could be proven, and what was still only Melissa's word against Daniel's? What I knew, the message existed. Daniel had been making frequent, unexplained trips to Seattle. His behavior had changed over the years in ways I'd chosen not to examine. His phone was locked. There were calls I'd never been allowed to hear. What I needed: documentation, financial records, evidence of the second household, the children, the sustained double life. If what Melissa said was true, and some ice-cold instinct in me said it was, then there would be traces everywhere. Money doesn't disappear without a trail. 10 years of supporting 2 children leaves marks. And then something shifted in me. Somewhere around 3 a.m., with Scout snoring softly at the foot of the bed and the house perfectly quiet around me, I stopped grieving and started planning. I had 3 advantages Daniel didn't know about. First, I was a joint account holder on every financial account we shared. Second, Patricia Okafor was not only a family law attorney, she was one of the best divorce attorneys in Multnomah County, with a reputation for financial forensics. And third, perhaps most importantly, Daniel thought I didn't know. That was his mistake. I'd spent 10 years watching him practice his precision, his careful management of appearances. He was good at it, but he had made one fundamental error. He had underestimated me. He'd seen what he wanted to see: a trusting wife, a woman content in her domestic corner, someone who took things at face value. He'd never asked himself what I might do if I stopped. I thought about Melissa's message. He chose me, the confidence of it, the cruelty of it. She'd written that message to wound me, to establish a hierarchy, to make me feel small and replaceable. What she didn't understand, what neither of them understood, was that I wasn't interested in competing. I wasn't going to fight for a man who had built a lie so elaborate and so sustained that it had eaten 10 years of my life. What I was going to do was make sure that when this was over, I was the one still standing. I met with Patricia the next afternoon. I walked into her office on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, sat down across from her desk, and put my phone on the table with Melissa's message pulled up on the screen. Patricia read it. She looked at me steadily. "Tell me everything." I did. Patricia Okafor's office was clean and spare in the way that serious people's offices often are. No clutter, no sentiment on display, just bookshelves of case law and a single framed print of Harriet Tubman on the wall behind her desk. I remember noticing that print. I found it steadying. We talked for 2 hours. I laid out everything I knew: the timeline of behavioral changes, the Seattle trips, the locked phone, the message. Patricia listened without interrupting, taking notes in a leather-bound notebook with a pen, old-fashioned and deliberate. When I finished, she set her pen down. "This is not going to be simple," she said, "but it's also not going to be impossible. If what this woman says is accurate, and Daniel has been financially supporting a second household for 7 or more years, using marital assets, that's dissipation of marital property. Oregon courts take that seriously." She referred me to a forensic accountant, a man named Robert Cheng who worked 2 floors down in the same building, and who, Patricia told me with the faintest trace of satisfaction, had previously worked as a CPA for a regional bank and knew exactly where money went when people tried to make it disappear. I hired them both that afternoon. I put the retainer on a credit card I'd had in my own name since before we married, a small financial thread of independence I'd maintained almost without thinking, the way you keep a spare key in a drawer just in case. On the way home, I stopped at our bank. I didn't move any money. I simply requested 6 months of statements for our joint accounts, something I was fully entitled to do as a joint holder. And I sat in my car in the parking garage and began to look. It didn't take long. The withdrawals were regular and patterned, always in amounts just under the threshold that would trigger a notation, always on the same days of the month. Between $1,500 and $2,000, drawn as cash or transferred to an account I didn't recognize. Over 6 months alone, more than $10,000. I photographed every page with my phone and emailed the images to Patricia before I started the car. Daniel came home from Seattle 2 days later. He walked through the front door with his overnight bag and his usual half-apologetic, half-relieved smile, the expression of a man returning to the comfort of a life he'd been neglecting. And I handed him a glass of wine and asked about his trip. I watched him very carefully while he answered. He was good. He was very good. The details were specific. The fatigue was real. The transition from away back to home looked authentic. If I hadn't known what I knew, I would have believed him entirely. But I did know. And so I watched the man I had been married to for 10 years as though I were watching a stranger, cataloging every word, every gesture, filing it all away. He noticed something. I could tell by the small adjustment he made, a subtle recalibration, the way a person leans into a room to check its temperature before entering fully. He looked at me once across the kitchen with an expression I couldn't quite name. Not suspicion, something closer to alertness. "You seem quiet," he said. "Long week," I said. "Grating." He nodded. He accepted it. That was the thing about a decade of marriage. You accumulate enough shorthand that a lie can pass invisibly through it. Melissa, I learned later, had been waiting for a response to her message. She'd sent it expecting either devastation or confrontation. Tears, accusations, a panicked phone call to Daniel. She'd wanted a reaction. What she got was silence. And silence, for someone like Melissa, was its own kind of threat. I know this because of what she did next. She sent a second message 4 days after the first. This one was shorter. "I see you got my message. I want you to know I'm not going anywhere. We're a family. Whatever you're thinking of doing, it won't change that." I forwarded it to Patricia without responding. Patricia told me to keep doing exactly that. "Let her talk," she said. "Every message she sends is evidence of her state of mind." The proof, the first piece of hard documentary proof, came from Robert Cheng on a Thursday morning, 10 days after I'd first sat in Patricia's office. He called me at 8:15. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, "I've traced the recurring transfers from your joint account. The receiving account is held in the name of Melissa A. Hart at a credit union in Seattle. The transfers go back at least 6 years in the records I've obtained so far. I'm still working backward." I sat down on the edge of the bed. Scout came and pressed against my leg. "How much?" I asked. A brief pause. "In the 6 years of records, I have currently approximately $140,000. The number hung in the air of my bedroom like something physical. $140,000. Of our money. My money. Money I had earned grading papers and writing curriculum and sitting through budget meetings, transferred month by month into Melissa Hart's account, into their life, to build something that was supposed to stay hidden from me forever. "Thank you, Robert," I said very quietly. I hung up. I looked out the window at our front porch, the hanging ferns, the street I had walked down every morning for 10 years. There was no going back now. There was only forward. Patricia filed the petition on a Monday. We had spent the previous week preparing every document. the bank statements, the transfer records, Robert Cheng's preliminary forensic report, both of Melissa's text messages, and a sworn declaration I had written and signed detailing the behavioral changes I had observed over the years. It was thorough. It was methodical. Patricia said it was one of the cleaner sets of initial documentation she'd worked with, and I understood she meant it as a compliment. The petition cited irreconcilable differences and listed as a separate financial matter the dissipation of marital assets, a legal term that meant, in plain language, that my husband had been stealing our shared money to fund another woman's household for nearly a decade. Daniel was served at his firm's office on a Tuesday afternoon. I knew the approximate hour it would happen. I was at school, sitting through a department meeting about the fall curriculum, watching the clock with a strange internal stillness. He called me 17 minutes after the server left his office. I let it go to voicemail. He called 4 more times in the next hour. I let those go too. When I got home that evening, I found him sitting in the kitchen, the papers on the table in front of him, his face doing something I had never seen it do before. A kind of disorganized expressiveness, control slipping at the edges. Daniel, who was always contained, always measured, looked for the first time like a man who didn't know what to do with his hands. "Claire." His voice came out wrong. "We need to talk about this." "You can speak with my attorney," I said. I took Scout's leash from the hook by the door and put it on him. Patricia Okafor. Her contact information is on the document. I took Scout for a walk. I walked for 45 minutes through our neighborhood while the last of the spring light came through the maple trees, and I felt not happiness, not triumph, but something quieter and more durable, something that felt like solid ground. The escalation came from Melissa. I should have anticipated it. I did anticipate it in the abstract, but the specific form it took still caught me off guard. She called my school, not my personal phone, the school's main number. She identified herself to the administrative assistant as a parent with a concern about one of the English teachers. She was transferred to the vice principal's office, where she proceeded to tell a story, fabricated, I would later demonstrate, about me having behaved erratically and unprofessionally toward a student. I learned about this from my vice principal, Donna Reardon, who called me into her office with the expression of a woman already prepared to be embarrassed by what she was about to say. She was a fair person, Donna. She told me exactly what had been reported, and then she said carefully, "I looked up the student she named. He transferred to Jefferson in February. He hasn't been in this building in 3 months." "She made it up," I said. Donna looked at me steadily. "I suspect so. I'm not pursuing it, but I thought you should know someone is trying to make trouble for you at work." I went back to my classroom. I sat at my desk for a moment. Then I forwarded Donna's account, written up in a brief email Donna had agreed to send me, to Patricia, with a note. "Harassment of my workplace. Please document." 2 days later, Daniel came to the house while I was home. He arrived with a man I didn't recognize, a lawyer I assumed by the suit and the briefcase, though not anyone I'd seen before. They stood on the porch, and Daniel spoke through the screen door. "I want to talk to you about what you're doing," he said. "You're making a serious mistake. If you pursue this the way you're pursuing it, it's going to hurt both of us. We can negotiate. We can settle this privately." "Call Patricia," I said. "Claire." His voice shifted, something harder under it now. "You don't understand what you're getting into. Those financial records, there are explanations for all of it. My attorney says what you've filed is aggressive and frankly retaliatory. If you push this, we'll push back. We have grounds." "Call Patricia," I said again, and I closed the door. My hands were shaking slightly as I walked to the kitchen. I stood at the sink and breathed for a moment. Then the shaking stopped, and in its place was something firmer. They were afraid. That was what this was. If he had been confident, he would have called Patricia himself. Instead, he'd come here, to this door, to look me in the face and try to make me back down the way I'd been backing down for years. Not this time. They retreated. The calls stopped for a week. The pressure went quiet. I drove to the coast that weekend. I rented a small room in Cannon Beach, and I spent 3 days walking on the sand and reading and sleeping 10 hours a night. Scout came with me. I needed to remember what it felt like to exist outside of this fight, to be a person with a body that needed salt air and sleep and the sound of waves. When I drove back to Portland on Sunday evening, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Ready. The week I came back from Cannon Beach, a letter arrived from Daniel's attorney. It was framed carefully. 3 pages of formal language that added up to a simple offer: accept a modest settlement and walk away quietly. The letter cited the complexity of the financial questions involved and the desire of both parties to avoid prolonged litigation. It suggested that the forensic accounting process was premature and potentially damaging to both parties' financial interests. I read it at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and then I photographed it and sent it to Patricia. She called within the hour. "They're scared of the forensic report," she said. "This offer is insulting. It's about 30% of what you're actually entitled to. Don't respond to it. Let me respond to it." "Do that," I said. I felt nothing when I set the phone down. Not relief, not anger, not the flicker of temptation I think they were counting on. I had been afraid that a settlement offer might weaken me, that some tired, grieving part of me would look at the word done and want to reach for it. But I looked at that letter and felt only clarity. They wouldn't offer me anything I didn't need to fight for. Every concession they made would come from pressure, from documentation, from the slow forward motion of a legal process they could no longer control. My coldness surprised me. I had thought grief would be the dominant emotion. Instead, it had become something else, a kind of organized steadiness, a sense that I was finally, at 41, moving through the world with my eyes fully open. But I knew I couldn't do it alone, not emotionally. The legal machinery was in motion and I trusted it. But there is a particular loneliness that comes from sitting inside a catastrophe that most people in your daily life don't know is happening. I told no one, not my colleagues, not my neighbors, not even my sister in North Carolina. I told my sister on a Thursday night. I sat on the back porch with the phone and a blanket and the dark garden around me, and I told her everything. Her name is Ruth, and she is 5 years older than me and has always been steadier. She didn't say much while I talked. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Are you sleeping?" she asked. "Better than before." "Are you eating?" "Yes." "Okay," she said. "Then you're going to be fine. You know that, right?" I didn't know it, not yet, but hearing her say it helped. She drove up from Eugene. She'd moved there 6 years ago for a university job, that Saturday, and we spent the day walking through the Saturday market and eating lunch by the river. She didn't make me talk about it constantly. She understood that sometimes the most useful thing another person can do is simply sit beside you inside a normal day and let the normal day be enough. I also found, through Patricia's referral, a support group for women going through contested divorces. I was resistant to this at first. I've never been someone who shares easily with strangers. But I went once to a Wednesday evening meeting held in the back room of a church in Northeast Portland, and I sat in a circle of 9 women of varying ages and listened for the first hour and then talked for 10 minutes. And something I hadn't expected happened. I stopped feeling crazy. That was what isolation had been doing to me. I understood, making me doubt my own perception, question my own decisions, wonder if I was being too hard, too aggressive, too much. Sitting in a room with women who had been gaslit and deceived and financially cheated and who were still standing and still fighting, it recalibrated something. It reminded me that what I was doing was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of self-preservation. I went back the following Wednesday, and the Wednesday after that. Meanwhile, Daniel and Melissa appeared to have gone quiet. Patricia told me this was consistent with a legal strategy. They were buying time, waiting to see whether I would blink. Daniel had stopped calling. He was staying at a hotel in the Pearl District. I knew from court documents that listed his address. Melissa had gone silent too. No more messages. I found myself thinking about her sometimes, not with hatred, with something more complicated. She had known about me for 10 years. She had been in this, fully and knowingly, for as long as Daniel had. She had made the calculation, year after year, that what she was getting was worth what she was participating in. And she had sent that message, "He chose me," with such certainty. Did she really believe it? Or had she been trying to believe it? I didn't know. I didn't need to know. What I knew was that she was watching. They both were. Watching to see what I would do next. I let them watch. They came on a Saturday morning in late April, when the dogwood in the front yard was blooming and the street was quiet. I was in the kitchen when I saw Daniel's car pull up. And then I saw the passenger door open, and I understood what this was. He had brought her. Melissa Hart was shorter than I'd imagined. Dark hair, practical clothes, the kind of face that might have been warm in a different context. She stood on my front walk beside my husband, former husband in every way that now mattered to me, and the sight of them together in front of my house on my street was one of the more surreal experiences of my life. For a moment, the world went very flat and strange. Then I breathed. I opened the door before they knocked. "Claire." Daniel's voice was carefully pitched, low, reasonable, conciliatory. "We just want to talk. 10 minutes. That's all." I looked at him. I looked at her. "You can have 5 minutes on the porch," I said. "I'm not inviting you in." They came up the steps. I stood in the doorway with the screen door between us, and I waited. Daniel spoke first. He'd clearly prepared this. The words were too smooth for improvisation. He was sorry. He knew he'd caused pain. He wasn't here to excuse what had happened, but he was asking me to consider whether the path I was on was really what I wanted, whether dragging this through the courts, making everything public, spending years in litigation was truly in my interest. There was a simpler way, a quieter way. "The forensic accounting," he said, "is going to be ugly for both of us. Things are going to come out that, Claire, there are professional implications for me, for my firm. If this gets into the press—" "I didn't make it ugly," I said. He paused. Then Melissa spoke. This surprised me. She'd been standing slightly behind him, and I'd assumed the performance was his alone. "I know what you must think of me," she said. Her voice was measured. She'd prepared too. "And I understand it. But I'm a mother. My children have a father who loves them, and this process, these allegations, are going to affect them. They're 7 and 4. They don't understand any of this. I'm asking you, woman, to consider them." I looked at her for a long moment, woman to woman. She had written he chose me in a text message designed to devastate me, and then stood on my porch, invoking our shared womanhood. Your children, I said carefully, were brought into this situation by decisions you and my husband made together. That's not my responsibility to manage. Her expression shifted, just slightly. A tightening around the eyes, the mask adjusting. We're not here to threaten you, Daniel said quickly. We're here to offer a solution. If you withdraw the dissipation claim, just that portion, we can settle everything else quickly and fairly. Patricia and my attorney can work out the terms in a week. You'd be done with this. There it was. That was what they'd come for. I thought about it. Not because I was tempted, but because I wanted to fully understand the shape of what they were offering. They wanted me to drop the claim that had the most legal and financial teeth. The dissipation of marital assets was the piece that could expose Daniel to the most significant liability. Without it, their exposure was manageable. With it, they were genuinely afraid. No, I said. Daniel's composure cracked, just slightly, just for a moment. Claire, be reasonable. You are not thinking about the full picture here. I'm thinking about it very clearly, I said. Melissa's mask slipped further. The warmth she'd summoned was gone. You're doing this out of spite, she said, and her voice had an edge in it now that told me this was her real voice, the one underneath the prepared script. You want to punish us. That's all this is. No, I said again. This is about what's mine. They stood on my porch for another moment, and I watched them recalibrate, the two of them, their shared project of managing me, failing in real time. Then Daniel said something under his breath that I chose not to acknowledge, and they turned and went down the steps. I stood in the doorway and watched them get into the car. I watched the car pull away. Then I went inside and I stood in the kitchen and I let myself feel it. The small, cold thread of fear, because they were not harmless people, and this had not gone well for them. And I knew that when people like this failed at the soft approach, they did not simply give up. But the fear didn't weaken me. It had stopped doing that. Instead, it clarified things, the way cold air clarifies a morning, sharpened everything into focus, reminded me of the stakes, confirmed that I was in a real fight against people who had resources and motivation and nothing left to lose by escalating. Good, I thought. Let them escalate. Let them show the court exactly who they were. I called Patricia that afternoon and told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment. Document the visit, she said. Exact time, who was present, what was said. I want it in writing by Monday. Already started, I said. The deposition was scheduled for a Thursday in early June in a conference room in Patricia's building. I'd spent the previous week reviewing the forensic report with Robert Cheng, going over every figure, every trace transaction, every linked account. I knew the numbers better than Daniel did. That was the thing he hadn't counted on, that I am, at my core, a teacher, and teachers know how to study. I arrived 15 minutes early. Patricia was already there, her files arranged in the particular organized way I'd come to recognize as her version of calm, not absence of feeling, but feeling converted entirely into function. She looked at me when I came in and said, "How are you?" "Ready," I said. Daniel arrived with his attorney, a man named Garrett Ellis, whom Patricia had described to me as technically competent but not especially imaginative. Melissa arrived separately with her own legal representation, a situation that had developed in the last 2 weeks when it became clear that Melissa's interests and Daniel's interests were not in fact identical. Their attorneys had stopped coordinating fully. That, Patricia had told me, was a very good sign. Daniel looked older than he had a month ago. It was the first time I'd seen him in a formal legal setting, and the context stripped something from him. The easy social confidence that was his most effective tool didn't work here, in a room designed for precision and documentation, where charm couldn't move through. He glanced at me when he came in. I looked back at him without expression and then returned my attention to my notes. Under questioning, Daniel's account of the financial transfers was what Patricia had predicted. He claimed the money had been for professional development expenses and consulting fees paid to Melissa as a, here his attorney had been creative, independent design contractor whose firm had provided services to his architectural practice. Patricia let him explain this in full. She let his attorney elaborate. She was patient in the way that she was patient about everything. Utterly architecturally patient. Then she presented the banking records, all of them, 6 years of transfers, cross-referenced with Melissa's personal account statements, cross-referenced with no registered business license, no tax documentation of contractor payments, no professional invoices filed, and this was Robert Cheng's most careful work, a pattern of transfer timing that correlated precisely with school enrollment dates, pediatric medical billing, and the lease renewals on Melissa's apartment in Seattle's Fremont neighborhood. The room was quiet for a moment when Patricia finished laying it out. Garrett Ellis said, "We'd like to request a brief recess." "Of course," Patricia said. During the recess, I sat in the hallway with a cup of coffee and looked out the window at the city. Patricia came to stand beside me. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. We both understood something had just shifted. When the session resumed, the cracks were visible. Daniel's story had been adjusted. Not substantially, just enough that it now contradicted 2 specific things he'd said before the recess. Melissa's attorney, in a separate exchange, offered a version of events in which Melissa had believed the financial arrangement was formally agreed upon between the parties, a claim that implied Daniel had made explicit representations to her, which Daniel's attorney immediately moved to contest. They were arguing with each other through their attorneys, in a deposition, about whether Daniel had been honest with Melissa or only with me or with neither of us. Patricia asked Melissa directly on the record, "Were you aware that Mrs. Whitmore had no knowledge of the financial transfers to your account?" Melissa looked at her attorney. Her attorney said, "My client will not answer that." "Were you aware that the funds transferred to your account originated from a joint marital account?" "My client will not." "Were you aware?" Patricia said, with the particular patient emphasis she used when she was making a record, at any point during the 10-year period in question, that Mr. Whitmore represented to his wife that those funds did not exist? Silence. And then, to her attorney's visible alarm, Melissa said, "He told me she knew." Daniel went very still. "He told you Mrs. Whitmore knew about the financial arrangement?" Patricia asked. He said, Melissa stopped, looked at Daniel, and for the first time I saw something move across her face that wasn't calculation or performance, something rawer, angrier. He said she had agreed to it, that it was... She stopped again. That it was what? Patricia asked. Her attorney's hand came down on the table. "We're taking a break." But the sentence was already in the room. Already on the record. He had lied to her too. He had told Melissa that I knew, that I had consented to some arrangement that, of course, I never had. He had built his double life on 2 separate foundations of deception, one for each woman, and now those foundations were grinding against each other in a conference room while his attorneys tried to contain the damage. I looked at Daniel. He was not looking at me. He was looking at the table. I felt no triumph. Not yet. What I felt was something simpler, the satisfaction of having been right, of having built something careful and thorough and real, and having been here when it met the truth. The settlement offer that arrived 2 weeks after the deposition was a different document entirely from the first one. Gone was the careful, formal language designed to make me feel fortunate to accept 30 cents on the dollar. In its place, concession, line by line, the shape of what the case actually was. Patricia called me at home on a Tuesday evening. "They've moved substantially," she said. "Do you want me to walk you through it?" Yes, she did. I sat at my kitchen table with Scout beside me and listened as she described what Daniel's attorneys were now prepared to agree to, and I understood, not with satisfaction, exactly, but with a deep, settling recognition that the forensic process had worked, the documentation had worked, the deposition had worked. Robert Cheng's meticulous tracing of 6 years of transfers had made the dissipation claim essentially unjustifiable to contest in court. Daniel's attorneys had done the math and concluded that a trial would cost him more in every sense than settling. What the settlement provided, the family home on Maplewood Drive. It would be sold, and I would receive 60% of the proceeds, the court having accepted Patricia's argument that my contribution to the household had been disproportionate during the years Daniel was diverting funds, a financial judgment representing the dissipated marital assets, $147,000, which was Robert Cheng's final figure after a full 6 years of documented transfers. This was to be paid in full within 90 days, my full pension contributions untouched. Daniel's retirement accounts would be divided, with a portion coming to me. Spousal maintenance for 4 years, calculated at a rate that Patricia described as appropriate given the length of the marriage and the demonstrated financial harm. Daniel signed. His attorney signed. It went before the judge, who reviewed the terms and the supporting documentation, including the forensic report, which was now part of the court record, and approved the settlement without modification. The gavel came down on a Wednesday morning in August. I was in the courtroom. Patricia was beside me. The judge looked briefly at both parties and said, "Settlement approved. This matter is closed." I sat for a moment after the room began to move. Patricia put her hand briefly on my forearm. "Done," she said. But the consequences for Daniel didn't end in that courtroom. The court filings were public record. That was not something Daniel's attorneys had been able to prevent, despite attempts. Patricia had opposed every motion to seal, and the judge had agreed with her that there was no compelling reason to shield financial misconduct from the record. $147,000 in documented transfers to a woman who was not his wife, drawn from marital accounts over 6 years. It was part of the public record of the case. It took 3 weeks for someone at Daniel's firm to find it. I don't know who looked, or why, or whether it was curiosity or something more purposeful. What I know is that in early September, Daniel's name disappeared from the firm's website. A colleague of mine whose husband worked in commercial real estate mentioned it in passing, not knowing the full context. "Didn't you used to know someone at Caldwell Merritt? I heard one of their senior people left. Some kind of financial thing." I said I'd heard something similar. I left it there. Melissa's situation became clear to me over time, through sources I didn't seek out, mutual acquaintances in Seattle who knew people she knew, a parent at school whose sister worked in her neighborhood. The story that emerged was this. When the deposition record became available, specifically the portion in which Melissa had stated, on the record, that Daniel told her I had agreed to the arrangement, Daniel had moved quickly to reframe things between them. He had contacted her, apparently, with a version of events in which her testimony had damaged his case and his ability to provide for the children going forward. He had made it her fault. She had believed him about me for 10 years. It seemed she had somewhat more difficulty believing him about herself. By the time the settlement was finalized, they were no longer together. I know this not because I sought the information, but because it was simply the logic of what had happened in that conference room. He'd been exposed as someone who lied to both women about both women and the architecture of mutual benefit that had held their arrangement together hadn't survived the revelation. She had 2 young children and a lease on an apartment that had been funded by marital money that was now the subject of a legal judgment. Whatever she'd believed she was building, it had required Daniel's sustained deception to exist at all. Without it, the shape was different. I didn't feel sorry for her, but I didn't feel hatred either. I felt something much smaller and more honest, a tired acknowledgement that there were no clean hands in any corner of this, and that I was the only one who'd had no choice about being in it. The judgment was paid in full in October. I deposited the check, sat in my car in the bank parking lot, and drove home. I moved out of the house on Maplewood Drive in November, 6 weeks after the settlement check cleared. The house sold quickly. The Portland market cooperated, and I walked away from closing with enough to put a substantial down payment on a smaller place in the Sellwood neighborhood, a bungalow 3 blocks from the river with a yard that Scout immediately claimed as sovereign territory and a kitchen with better light than the old one. I painted it myself that winter. A friend helped me on the weekends, a woman named Jess, who I'd met at the support group and who had, by that point, become one of the better friendships of my adult life. We put on old music and painted the walls a warm terracotta in the living room and a deep green in the kitchen. And I remember standing back at the end of the second weekend and thinking, this is mine, not ours, not subject to any negotiation or revision or secret parallel claim, mine. The school year that followed was the best I'd had in a decade. That surprised me. I'd expected to feel depleted, diminished, a woman in the aftermath of damage. Instead, I felt, for the first time in years, fully present in my classroom. I stopped going through the motions of my days from behind glass. My students noticed, though they didn't know why. I got more engaged responses, better discussions, a few end-of-year notes from students that I saved in the folder I keep in my desk drawer. I applied for a curriculum lead position I'd been putting off for years, telling myself the timing wasn't right. I got it. It came with a modest salary increase and, more importantly, a sense that I was moving forward deliberately rather than simply continuing. Ruth came for a long weekend in the spring. We sat on my back deck in the early evening light. Scout spread between us like a throw rug, and she said, "You look different." Different how? She thought about it. Like yourself, she said finally. I understood what she meant. The years of background anxiety, the low-frequency vigilance that I'd never fully named, always interpreting and explaining and wondering, that had gone quiet. I had lived with it for so long I hadn't recognized it as unusual. Now, without it, I could feel the difference. The way you don't know a sound is bothering you until it stops. I heard about Daniel occasionally, indirectly, the way word travels in a city where you share a professional world with someone for a decade. He had not been taken on as a partner at another firm, as far as anyone knew. He'd started something smaller, solo practice, residential only. The kind of work that's honest but a long step down from where he'd been, from the trajectory he'd been on. The public financial record followed him. It tends to in professional communities. I didn't track it. I didn't need to. I mention it only because it was the realistic outcome, not cinematic ruin, not dramatic collapse, but the ordinary, persistent consequence of having done something that became part of the public record. Reputations are built slowly, and they erode the same way. He would carry it. That was enough. Melissa's situation was harder by all accounts, and here I do feel the complexity of it. She had built her life around an arrangement that required his sustained commitment, and when the structure was exposed, the commitment went with it. She was raising 2 children largely on her own, working, navigating a child support arrangement that Daniel had apparently already disputed. The children still had their father. I suppose that was something. But the life she'd believed she was building, the one she'd written he chose me to announce, looked considerably different in practice from how she'd imagined it. I thought about her sometimes, in the way you think about the shape of a wound after it's healed, not with anger, with something that was almost, not quite pity, not quite understanding, but a recognition that she had been used too, in her own way, and that she had also participated, and that both of those things were true simultaneously, and that I didn't have to resolve them. I started running again, something I'd stopped in my early 30s. Early mornings before school, Scout trotting beside me through the Selwood streets while the city came awake. I began cooking more deliberately, not meals for 2, not the habitual management of another person's preferences, but food I genuinely wanted to eat, dishes I made on Sunday afternoon with music on and no particular timeline. Small things. They sound small when I describe them, but they were the substance of a life reclaimed, and I knew their value in a way I couldn't have known before I nearly lost them. I was 42. I felt more like myself at 42 than I had at 35 or even 30. That was the unexpected gift in all of it. Not the outcome I would have chosen, but real nonetheless. And I had made that one call. On a rainy Tuesday in March, with a devastating text message on my screen and a golden retriever at my feet, I had picked up the phone and called not in panic, not in rage, but with the first cold clarity of a decision made. That call had been the beginning of everything that came after. What would you have done? If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. And thank you for listening to the whole thing. It mattered to tell it.